Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm grateful to be here in the first place. And given the time constraints, I've decided to divide my remarks into 4 points. So my first point is an increased interest in freedom of religion or belief. I'm seeing an increased interest, and just to give you a few random examples, Ambassador Hackett just mentioned a minute ago Human Rights Council Resolution 1618. I don't want to go into technical details. One might even debate whether it's strictly speaking a freedom of religion resolution, but I mean it marks a point, a turning point after a decade of sterile debate between the OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, and the Western world about whether defamation of religion should be considered a problem, even an offense. And now, I mean, there is a consensus. What we have to do is we have to protect human beings against negative stereotyping also in this field. So there is a relationship, I would say, also at least somehow to freedom of religion or belief. Last year in the UN, the Minorities Forum, which takes place on a regular basis, on an annual basis, was dedicated to religious minorities for the first time ever. So also the minorities approach now gets more and more aspects of religious minorities on board. And I mean, I would say there are lots of passionate discussions and of course controversies taking place in the UN framework. But at least, I mean, the topic's very much there. And also after Tom Farr's rather skeptical remarks on the EU, which I share to a degree, I would also nevertheless mention the EU guidelines on freedom of religion or belief, which were adopted a year ago, and now we have to see whether they really make a difference. I have my doubts still, but nevertheless there is some commitments, and it's our responsibility to turn that into real action. So I would say there is an increased interest. You can also see that in academic debates like this one, in NGO activities, in all sorts of books. Pasquale just passed me this one. However, I mean, the motives underneath that increased interest are ambivalent ones. I mean, on the one hand, more and more people seem to appreciate that religion, for whatever reasons, is an important factor of human life. Not only for persons' private lives, but also for public life, for individuals, for communities. It's important. It's also a political factor. So some people appreciate that, I mean, in a genuine understanding, that it's good and it enriches our understanding, our self-understanding as human beings. At the same time, one cannot ignore a certain degree of skepticism, very often setting in these discussions as well. So what many people also have in mind whenever a topic like religion comes up, it's Syria, now Iraq, Central African Republic, Nigeria, India was also mentioned with Narendra Modi's victory. So religion, also sometimes a factor of human life that makes politics and diplomacy rather complicated. So the increased interest is driven by very different assessments, by very different motives which I share, motives which I do not share in the same sense, but one cannot ignore also some skeptical grounding underneath. So that's my first point. Okay, now we are already on the second point. I would say much of the attention currently focused on freedom of religion or belief is strongly based on an interest in conflict prevention, I mean, which has something to do with just my last remark. To give you one example, many of you will not know it, and I can't go into details, but in 2012, the United Nations adopted an action plan, the Rabat Plan of Action, focusing on incitement to hatred. I think it's a very interesting document, an interesting, also very practical document about what we can do, we meaning governments, but also the media, academics, religious communities, to overcome hatred or to combat hatred, to respond to hate speech, not primarily by resorting to restrictions, but with alternative positive speech. I mean, a quite interesting action plan. But again, what you see here is a strong emphasis on conflict prevention or conflict management. So, I mean, also the increased attention to freedom of religion or belief is partially driven by, I mean, a peace logic. And here I find it important, of course I'm also in favor of peace, I'm in favor of conflict prevention, I was part of the Rabat Plan, I'm selling the Rabat Plan. Nevertheless, we should be very much aware that a peace logic and a human rights logic is not totally the same thing. It's not the same thing. If you are chiefly dealing with religion or religions in the plural, in order to prevent conflicts, in order to promote peace, you will naturally focus on the powerful and influential ones. So religious leaders, so influence matters, power matters. And I mean, the very small ones usually do not play any role in these pictures. And here the human rights approach is different, because the starting point for human rights and also for freedom of religion or belief as a human right is the dignity of the human being and the equal dignity of all human beings, and the rights based on this dignity, the right to live in accordance to one's faith, whether it's a majority religion or a minority one, a big one, a small one, an old one, a new one. I mean, it's really there. The human rights approach is different. And sometimes, I mean, the peace logic and the human rights logic are not entirely the same thing. There can be conflicts between them. Let me give you one example, and then I move to the second last point. The one example comes from my country visit, which I undertook in March and April to Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan is very proud in a sort of successful management of religious diversity. But the diversity that counts here in that successful management is Sunni Islam, Russian Orthodox Christianity. I mean, those are the powerful groups, the majority and the powerful Russian minority. And so they are proud of having maintained some stability by creating harmony, by creating peaceful communication between these groups. Okay, it's an accomplishment, but nevertheless, I mean, I did this visit from my perspective, freedom of religion and belief, and here I had a lot of criticism, because the small religious groups, the new religious groups, never made it into these conferences. I mean, they were outside of the picture. I mean, they were even further marginalized by this approach on the big ones, how they share the influence zones. That's why, I mean, here from a human rights perspective, one should be aware human rights can become also an element of peace by respecting all human beings. But one has to say, that's not always the case, first of all, and the peace promoted by human rights is not simply harmony. And in Kazakhstan, there was too much talk about harmonious relations, harmony between the groups, harmony. I would always say, I mean, human rights, if human rights are a peace agenda, it's a not too harmonious peace agenda. My heart beats for the troublemakers, for of course the non-violent troublemakers. So Ahmadis, for instance, some Jehovah's Witnesses, the little group, the small group who are very vulnerable, including sometimes in peace settings. And so that's why, I mean, these different logics, they may somehow come together, but they are not the same. It's important to keep that in mind. Now my third point and second last point. Again, caution, caution, caution. There is a recent trend to merge freedom of religion or belief with anti-racism agendas. To a certain degree, I find it plausible, because, I mean, on the phenomenological level, you see overlaps between religious minorities suffering from discrimination, ethnic minorities suffering from discrimination, very often the same groups, sometimes under the auspices of religion, sometimes under the auspices of ethnicity, and often you cannot really tell these things apart. So I do appreciate that there are overlaps, but nevertheless, on a conceptual level, it's highly dangerous. It's highly dangerous. And here one has really to pay attention to what's going on also in workshops of the United Nations on complementary standards that are currently elaborated, complementary standards to the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Because if you just put religion into the anti-racism box, what easily then is lost out of sight is that religion is different from ethnicity. And you can't treat religion just as in analogy to ethnic group characteristics, because otherwise what will be lost, or what easily gets out of sight, is the most disquieting part of freedom of religion or belief, and that's the right to change. You can't change your skin color, at least, I mean, okay, some people would say, but it's a different thing. Let's be pragmatic, and it's a different thing. So ethnic characteristics is one thing, but here we have a claim even to change. And not only to change that I change my religion, I can even invite others to change their religion. Of course, I shall never use any coercion in that context, but I mean, the right to change and also the right to induce others to change, to try to persuade them non-coercively. That has always been the most controversial part of freedom of religion or belief. But I would say without that, what remains is not freedom of religion or belief. It's a very loose respect rhetoric. We have to respect one another, the groupings that we are. It would not be freedom of religion or belief any longer. Freedom of religion or belief without the test case of conversion would remain an empty shell. Let me also share you one example. In February, I went to India. India was already mentioned by Tom Farr in his previous talk. And I was shocked by what I heard one interlocutor tell me. I mean, it was not his personal opinion. He said the following: Muslims are perceived as terrorists, Christians are perceived as missionaries. I mean, that's shocking for a number of reasons. I mean, also the Islamophobic component, equating Islam to terrorism, that's of course outrageous. But then, I mean, the analogy of missionary work with terrorism, just imagine that, yeah? So different ways of attacking the Hindu culture. Hindutva, the aggressive Hindu ideology, was mentioned by Tom Farr. I could also get first-hand impression of what's going on here. It's just one example of a country in which missionary activities are seen always as a dirty word, the M word, missionary, dirty. And you can find that in many countries, also in many Islamic countries. Yesterday, we issued a press release, 4 rapporteurs, on the draft anti-conversion law in Myanmar. I mean, the same thing is happening there, under the auspices of Buddhism, of course, not with the agreement of all Buddhist monks. There are some opposition people also, yeah? So I would say, I mean, it's really the test case. You can't have freedom of religion or belief without that element of change, because only then you have the freedom also to remain in your faith, in your inherited faith. It would not be an act of freedom unless you have the opportunity to think about it, to reconsider it, to maybe come to different decisions, talk with others, communicate, and perhaps change, which is normally not an easy act. But here we have a test case. And for that reason, we have to be very cautious. We have to exercise caution whenever issues of anti-racism and freedom of religion are conceptually mixed. I do acknowledge the phenomenological overlaps, but we should not draw the wrong systematic conclusion. There is a real danger. Now I come to my last point. Okay, dangerous. Dangers lie elsewhere. I'm not too pessimistic, by the way, but nevertheless we have to face them. And I agree with Tom Farr that there are lots of dangers also in our Western countries. And let me give you one example from my own country, which is Germany. 2 years ago, you know it, 2 years ago, we had a very bizarre discussion in Germany on male circumcision. A complicated topic, very complicated. I had to do lots of interviews, which usually triggered a shitstorm subsequently. It was not pleasant. Oh, it was not pleasant at all, I can tell you. But then, what I'm telling you now is not a joke. the first question in most of these interviews was actually the following. What do you think should prevail? Religious freedom or human rights? Religious freedom or human rights? Just imagine that. So the assumption was of religion or belief is not really a human rights. Maybe somehow, technically speaking, it is, but not legitimately, no. Maybe for some historic reasons, religious freedom made it into some human rights catalogs, but is it really justified? Question mark. And I mean, many people would say, we don't know, maybe not. Some even say aggressively, no, 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 3 exclamation marks. And that shocked me. And I've tried to understand. So the assumption, it's all wrong, but the usual assumption is, yes, I'm aware, thank you. Okay, human rights is something human, and religion is something transhuman. How does it fit together? The human and the transhuman? Maybe not. Some people would say so. Freedom of religion is a universal right, and now human rights are universal, and now religious freedom, doesn't this privilege the homo religiosus? Is it maybe merely the freedom of some rather the freedom of all? And is it a freedom in general? I mean, because religions very much have to do with subordinating oneself to a divine will. And what about equality? I mean, with all the extra treatments that religious minorities sometimes ask for. I would say all these perceptions are totally wrong, because, I mean, of course, freedom of religion or belief, it doesn't protect religions, it protects human beings, but human beings as very complex beings, with also very complex existential needs and demands. So the complexity of the human condition here comes into play. It's not only a privilege for those who are religiously interested in any specific sense. I think it's really to the benefit of everyone. It's a right to freedom, but then freedom cannot simply be equated with a certain urban, ironic lifestyle. If there's something like human rights liberalism would be more ambitious than lifestyle liberalism. And the equality that we have to fight for here is not just sameness. It's also, again, a rather complex equality which has to do with the complexities of the human condition. So let me conclude. We have standards. A freedom of religion or belief is enshrined in the Universal Declaration. It was already mentioned in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's the right to search for an ultimate meaning, to come to different results, maybe also to no results, to communicate, to also challenge others, to invite others to change, to rejoin, to live in accordance with one faith. It's a very practical right, to do so as an individual, but also in community with others, in your private life, in public life, and maybe also to try to make a difference in political life. So it's a very rich and broad understanding. You can't have human rights without freedom of religion or belief. If you remove that specific right, I mean, you would not only be left with a gap, I would say the whole system would collapse. And you can't have freedom of religion or belief without taking into account the test case conversion. And if you want to use freedom of religion or belief for a human rights-based peace agenda, be aware, it will be a rather complicated peace, a not too harmonious peace. But I'm not so sure whether harmony is really what we need. Thank you very much.